us what struck your interest in this week's chat. And somebody who is joining us from Ibiza, I am incredibly envious. So, hi everyone, what a week we have been in. And this week, we really got into the kishkas, the intestines, right? The real internal organs of both the laws of being a Nazirite and the human body. We started out with a discussion of when a Nazirite finishing their vow can start drinking wine again, which led us to address questions of a Nazirite with alopecia or a Nazirite who doesn't have hands. We then moved to talking about what happens if a Nazirite shaves once some of their offerings have been offered, only to discover that one or more was invalid. And then what to do if someone who offers some of their vows, some of their offerings becomes ritually impure halfway through. Do they have to start all over again? Or do they have to, or can they just sort of pick up where they left off? Next, and I'm seeing Rob in the chat also, this is what struck you, Rob. Right, the high priest and the Nazirite are obligated to bury a mate mitzvah, a person who is a dead body that has been found on the side of the road where anyone can, but nobody has buried them. And everybody is obligated to bury them, including the high priest and the Nazirite. But if a high priest and a Nazirite are on a walk together, which of them is obligated to become ritually impure in order to bury this mate mitzvah? Because apparently burial is a one-person job, so you only one of them needs to become impure. And this leads us into ranking the different kinds of high priests and Nazirites. Then we talked about how much of a corpse needs to be present in order to transmit corpse impurity. Right, how much of a corpse counts to be a corpse? Specifically, which matters to our context, because we're talking about how much of a corpse needs to be present to require a Nazirite to shave and restart their Nazirite period. And I can tell both from the chat and from various people's comments throughout that, like, we have all had enough of very specific discussions of bodily fluids and detritus. This discussion then gets interrupted by the story of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi and the potentially difficult student Sumachus. From there, we get into a discussion that I know a lot of you found really interesting, which is the question of the fetus and whether the fetus counts as part of a dead woman's body. And then we got to talking about whether amputated limbs transmit corpse impurity. And then we got into a discussion of spines and skulls. And then, blessedly, we finished the week. So this has been a real discussion of the human body in all its complexity after death. What I want to focus on actually in our discussion in our brief period of time today is what to do if two specific priests are walking around when they encounter a mate mitzvah, right, this dead body that they're obligated to bury. And the two priests are two very specific priests, the Kohen Mashuach and the Sigan. The Sigan is literally just the deputy or the vice high priest, but the Kohen Mashuach, or the anointed priest, is actually a very, very specific one. So I'm putting in the chat right now, this is a document. I'm going to share a screen, so you don't have to pull it up, but I know when I do this periodically, people ask, oh, can I see a copy? And this way you will have a copy. So right now you should be seeing my screen. You should also, if you choose, be able to join on in. I'm seeing some folks joining, which suggests that the link worked. So excellent. And I'm just going to jump on in. I'll read it in the English. Feel free to follow along in whatever language you prefer. So this is from Deuteronomy, and here's where we learn about the Kohen Mashuach, or the anointed priest. When you, an Israelite warrior, take the field against your enemies and see horses and chariots, forces larger than yours, have no fear of them, for your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt, is with you. Before you join battle, the priest shall come forward and address the troops. And he's going to give a speech. He shall say to them, "Hear, O Israel, you are about to join battle with your enemy. Let not your courage falter. Do not be in fear or in panic or in dread of them, for it is your God who marches with you to do battle for you against your enemy to bring you victory." So that's from Deuteronomy. And essentially what we learn here is before going to war, a specific priest comes out and gives a speech. So cool. Amazing. We're actually going to learn all of the laws of this specific priest really soon. So I don't want to get too far ahead, but I do want to just point out that the rabbis of the Mishnah say, okay, so this is a very specific priest, and this priest is anointed for this task. Anointing is just the fancy word for having oil put on their head. And in the time of the Torah, this seems to have been a sign that you've been chosen for a specific task. The word in English, Messiah, comes from the Hebrew Mashiach, which means one who has had that oil put on their head. And here we're talking about someone who has been chosen for the specific task of being with the people when they go out to war. Questions so far? Thoughts, everybody with me? Comments, concerns? The anointed priest. Can anybody hear me? Okay, great. Amazing. Just checking. I have definitely been on one of these where everybody was quiet and it was because they in fact could not hear me. So who anointed him? That's a wonderful question. Thank you, Erin. And what I will say is we are literally just about to get to these laws in, I want to say it's Sota. So we're going to learn more about this there. But the anointed priest, right, this Kohen Mashuach, is not the high priest, just for context. This is, the priesthood, much like everything else, had a bureaucracy. And so, right, we should imagine a world where there is a high priest and then his deputy, and there is a Kohen Mashuach. Yes, he would absolutely be surrounded by dead bodies, Saul, which is part of why we designate a specific priest to have this role. But the rabbis of the Torah and then the Mishnah, the Torah and then the rabbis of the Mishnah really focus in on the speeches he gives before they go off to battle. So it's not quite clear what his role is once they are fighting. So, but we have this very specific anointed priest. And the Talmud has a discussion, which I think is really interesting and actually gets to what I'm seeing some folks in the chat ask, which is, how does any of this relate to my life? So a dilemma was raised before them. This is from Nazir 47b. A priest anointed for war and the deputy high priest. Which of them is better suited to stay pure if they both encounter a mitzvah? Is it better that the priest anointed for war remain ritually pure so that he can be ready for war? Or perhaps it is better that the deputy high priest remain ritually pure because he's fit for service. So just for context, the deputy high priest doesn't actually have a job. He doesn't have a job. His job is essentially, much like the vice president of the United States, to have a pulse, right? He only kicks in if the high priest becomes impure and we need a high priest to do something. So his job is essentially to not do anything and stay pure. And oftentimes we could imagine that the deputy high priest gets used a lot if a high priest, tends to be impure, or could never be called on. So the question is, which of these two is most important? It's most important that they stay sort of on call, because one of them is going to not be on call if they become impure. Now, I want to also point out one of them has to become impure. The idea that we're going to leave this person is not floated. And I also want to note that the Meit Mitzvah, we don't know if this person is or is not Jewish. It's just a dead body. Now, you might say, okay, but we might be able to tell from some physical symbols whether or not this person is circumcised. And that's true. But I want to remind you that lots of people, like half of the world's population, isn't circumcised according to Jewish law. So if we see a body that doesn't have things to be circumcised, we assume they're Jewish. And if we see a body which could be circumcised and isn't, well, we end up wondering, person could be not Jewish, or they could be somebody who had a physical condition that exempted them from circumcision. So in general, when we see this dead body, we should assume it needs to be buried. Okay, so which of these two? The one who needs to sort of be on call all the time, or the one who has a really specific task in the times of war? Come and hear a resolution, as it is taught in a Breita, right, in an earlier tradition. Here's the difference between the high priest, the priest anointed for war, and a deputy. It's only that if they were walking along the way and found a Meit Mitzvah, the ruling is the one anointed for war becomes impure, and do not let the deputy become impure. So if you see, right, which of these two needs to become impure, the one anointed for war, not the deputy. And that's weird, right? Because the deputy doesn't actually have a job. His job is just to be alive and pure in case he's needed. But the one anointed for war has a job. And he's the only one who has this job. There's only one priest anointed for a specific war to address the troops. If he dies, we might anoint another one, but he doesn't have a backup. So it's a little bit strange, we might think, that the deputy high priest needs to stay pure and the one anointed for war doesn't. Now, and if we just keep going on, we get another distinction and then I'm going to open this up to conversation. The Gemara says, wait a minute, but we have a different earlier tradition, which seems to suggest that we prioritize the priest anointed for war. Isn't it taught in a different Breita? A priest anointed for war takes precedence over the deputy high priest. Mar Zutra said, this is not difficult. With regard to preserving his life, it's preferable to preserve the one anointed for war. What's the reason? The public depends on him in a time of war. So if their lives are being threatened, we prioritize the priest anointed for war because, right, this is a question of sort of public confidence in moments of crisis. But, right, so if, one of them is going to be killed or they've been kidnapped and we can only have enough money to ransom one of them, we prioritize the priest anointed for war. But when it comes to becoming impure, we prioritize the deputy high priest. So I want to turn now to you and ask, why do you think, and I'm going to stop sharing, but that link is still in the chat. So I will put it back in the chat so you can open it if you would like again. And I want to ask, why do you think it's important that the deputy high priest always be on call, even if the priest anointed for war becomes impure? Why are we prioritizing the deputy high priest and not the priest anointed for war? And I'd love to hear some genuine suggestions in the chat. So Andrea asks, is there always a backup? yes, there is always a backup for the high priest. But what's interesting is if the priest anointed for war becomes impure, there is no backup. So we're saying better to prioritize the backup for a role that's already filled than to make sure that each role has at least one person. Carol asks, isn't the anointed priest always impure? I want to just point out that in the Torah's discussion of the anointed priest, he shows up before the battle starts and gives a serious speech. And then we don't actually hear about him from the battle. So it's actually not clear that he's, I wouldn't necessarily picture him surrounded by dead bodies and things like that. Just because he sort of exits the scene before the actual battle. Right? Don't imagine, a European king leading the troops from the front. He's there, he gives the big battlefield address, and then I don't want to say he actually leaves. I want to say he exits the rabbi's discussion. Would it depend on how likely that there will be a war? Great question, Charles. I think what's interesting is the Talmud doesn't distinguish, right? So a priest is only anointed for battle when there is a war. This isn't one of those jobs that is a permanent bureaucracy job. This is a task-specific, right? This is, for those of you who sort of do various kinds of volunteer work, this is the difference between a standing committee and a task force, right? Here is the standing committee, that's your high priest and your deputy priest, but a task force is shown up at the time. Pepita, wonderful question. Why can't the high priest just take over for the anointed priest? There's actually a really specific answer, which is that the anointed priest is with the troops in battle, not in Jerusalem. And the high priest needs to be at the temple in Jerusalem. So it's literally a question of two, right? You can't be in two places at once. So I'm seeing a lot of folks put suggestions in, and I see, can we find Laura and maybe have her share her thought verbally? And while we're looking for folks, I see Laura, and then I see Rob has also given us a suggestion. So maybe if we can find those, and Laura, wonderful, yes. Oh, Laura, and you raised your hand, even better.
Well, just so you could try and find me.
Yeah, I know that's exactly okay. Why.
So obviously war could be dangerous to everyone, but if we don't have a high priest, we can't make sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem. If we can't make sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem, God may be very unhappy with all of us. And if God is unhappy in the home that we've created for God, God just might leave, in which case the community in Jerusalem is endangered, as well as those who were in battle. So,
wonderful suggestion. Thank you, Laura. Did we find Rob?
Yeah, so I think the rabbis made some comment about whether it's a temporary or permanent condition. So if you are near a dead body or they become ritually impure, does that knock you out for life or just for a week?
Just for a week. Right, you can then purify yourself and come back into your role. Yeah. And how about Danielle? Can we find Danielle?
Hi.
Hi.
The concept that I was just playing off of the idea that he's sort of out of the office, there's just no consistency, and also like the idea of the standing task force versus, or the standing committee versus the task force, like just thinking about it in terms of people not being available for the work. And he sort of just needs to be on duty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think here, what I take from this is the ways that this teaches us the value of consistency, right? We might think the crisis arises, we drop everything to respond to the crisis. And I want to be clear, we do respond to the crisis, right? We have anointed a priest to go to battle with the troops. But we prioritize the everyday, right? The things need to still happen even in moments of crisis, right? We still need to go back to my government bureaucracy, Social Security still needs to be paid. We still need to have traffic lights, right? All of the things that create a healthy society, which for the rabbis of the Mishnah includes regular sacrifices at the temple, need to still happen. And we need to address the crisis. I think that's really key, right? We need to address the crisis. But what strikes me is the way that this text really prioritizes making sure that society continues, right? That a crisis is temporary and society, ideally, is permanent. And so I saw at the very beginning, I saw a couple of folks ask, well, what do we take from this if I am not going to battle with the Israelites and I'm also not going to become a Nazirite? To which I say, like, good for you. It sounds like a terribly complicated thing to be. Then, how do we prioritize? And the answer is we focus on the everyday, right? We focus on the everyday. And I love Janine. Yes, when I was preparing this, what I was thinking of, Janine wrote, every day, that is the weekly Shabbat, is over holidays, right? Janine is noting, and if you joined us all the way back in Brachot, right, the very first tractate that we studied together, you noticed that when in our discussion about which blessings get said first on a Shabbat, which is also a holiday, right? So if Passover falls on Shabbat, do we say the blessings for Passover first or the blessings for Shabbat? And Janine is pointing out, we say the blessings over Shabbat, right? We prioritize the everyday over the exceptional. Absolutely. Wonderful. So I'm going to be honest with you, that is, and Rob points out a beautiful reminder, what a lovely thought I think we should always just highlight. Individuals should have plans for your own personal continuity, setting up a will, trust estate lawyers, health proxies, etc., POA, etc. So Aaron says this is complex. Focusing on the everyday is a mistake during an existential crisis. Thank you, Rob, power of attorney. And what I would say is, Aaron, we are focusing on the existential crisis, but the beauty of being in community is that we can have certain people be delegated for different tasks. So nobody's saying we shouldn't have an anointing priest, certainly, but that the anointing priest is a temporary need that doesn't mean we should suspend everything else. And I think here it's especially important, and I see a couple of folks notice this in the chat, that within the sort of rabbinic system, the high priest and the priests in the temple in general aren't just the everyday, they're maintaining a consistent relationship with God, which is the foundation to how the Israelites see the potential for their success, right? Their success in battle, but then also just in being a people in relationship with God. And I think that is something that they are prioritizing, right? Because at the end of the day, the reason you go to war, the reason you defend yourself, the reason you if you're being attacked, you fight back, is because you stand for something, right? You stand for something. You could just appease the enemy and say, okay, we'll be part of you now. But that's not what they're willing to do, because they stand for something. And the thing that they stand for is this relationship with God as it relates to their own life. And I agree with you 100%. That's a really complicated idea. But I also think just in our journey through the Daf, and especially as we are getting really into the details of what parts of corpses count for corpse impurity, it's worth taking a step back sometimes and saying, what might this tell us for our own lives about the value of, keeping the trains running in moments of crisis, or of keeping our relationships going in moments of crisis, relationships with God and with each other, right? What are the things that actually give us strength in moments of crisis to give us the power to do what we need to do? So that is all that I had on today's daf, but we do have another 3 minutes, and I do not want to cheat you of any of your time. So if anybody has any questions or comments about this part of the daf or any other, now is your chance. This whole week of Talmud was like extremely easy and everybody got it. I love that. That wasn't my experience, but I love that. Well, I'm not going to I'm not going to take up more of your time. So, wait, I just see something. I saw a comment. Where'd it go? Yes, and I do just want to say, I see somebody who says, I love how the rabbis, Sharna, I love how the rabbis know their bones, right? I think this is also a really good reminder that the rabbis are people and people have bodies and knowledge about bodies, and really at least try to understand the complexities of the human body, right? It's not just, oh, well, it's a mystery and it's from God. No, they really try to understand what bones are which and whether bones are human and all of these things. And it's kind of, for those in the room who might be in a medical profession, I hope you feel like, oh, there were people back 2,000 years ago who also cared about the details of human bodies. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you. Well, everybody, have a wonderful week. It was lovely to see you. I look forward to learning the next week of Daf with you. And I will see you all the next time I'm on.
Thanks
Bye,
everyone for
everyone.
being here. See you
Shabbat
next week.
shalom.